Well, remember, the book of Genesis has two major divisions. It's divided into two major parts. The first part, chapters 1 through 11, deal with four major events. The creation of the physical universe, the fall of man to sin, the judgment of man with the flood, and the separation of people into nations. The second section of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, deal with four major people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And they're all the sons of one another. Abraham's the father, and then Isaac, then Jacob, and Joseph. So we have four events: creation, fall, flood, and the nations, and then four people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And so that's just an outline of the book of Genesis. Well, last time we saw in chapter 36, God decided to fill us in about Esau, that was the brother of Jacob, and his descendants and his genealogy. Before that, in chapter 35, the life of Jacob, who is now named Israel. God changed his name to Israel. His life was kind of wrapped up, and we were given his family tree. And although we'll still read more about Jacob, he's no longer the main character in the rest of Genesis. But his next to youngest son, Joseph, is now the main character for the rest of the book of Genesis. And I find it very interesting that as the book of Genesis unfolds, it is continually zooming in. It's continually covering less time as it goes, but in much greater detail. God devoted one chapter to his creation. The universe and all it contains, the sun, moon, stars, the planets, earth, land, bodies of water, plants and animals and sea creatures and everything. All of that in one chapter. And now we will see God devoting about 14 chapters to the life of Joseph. 14 chapters, almost a quarter of the book of Genesis written about the life of this one man. So what does that tell us about God and his focus? What do you think is more important to God? The habitat he created or the people that he created the habitat for? One chapter on God building the habitat, 14 chapters devoted to one person living in that habitat. The world will tell you that Mother Nature is all about the habitat. The inhabitants are just those that are able to survive in this ever-changing habitat. Well, the Bible tells us that Father God is all about the inhabitants. He's all about the people. And he has and will change the habitat to suit the people. He changed it at the fall of man to sin. He changed it at the flood. He changed it at the Tower of Babel. And he will change it again soon, as we are told in the book of Revelation. There are animal rights activists that believe man should do nothing whatsoever that could possibly affect the natural habitat of an animal. Don't build a weather station in Antarctica. In fact, don't even send a photographer to capture the images of the penguins there. That alone, just someone, the snowmobile tracks or whatever, that alone could affect the habitat. It could be devastating, they say. They're all about Mother Earth. They're all about the habitat and allowing the habitat to govern what survives in it. Then there are animal lovers, employed in places like SeaWorld, let's say. They take care of penguins. And they love the penguins. They don't love just the idea of penguins living on a continent 8,000 miles away. I mean, that's awesome too. But no, they love these penguins, individual penguins. They name them sometimes. They train them. They take care of them. They consider the penguins their friends. I'm sure some refer to the penguins as their babies. Some people call their pets that. They give them everything they need, and they'll even change the habitat to better suit the penguin. God devotes one chapter to the habitat, 14 chapters to the life of one individual in that habitat. Where do you think God's heart is? Is his heart for the habitat he built in 6 days, or is his heart for the inhabitants who he spends a lifetime training and teaching and caring for? His friends, his children, his babies. Do you see how powerful this living, breathing Word of God is? Look at what we've learned about God so far, and we haven't even read a verse yet. We haven't even not one word, but looking at how God arranged it tells us so much about his focus, about his heart, about his love for us. Not his love for the world, but his love for the inhabitants of the world. His love for individuals, his love for you, and his love for me. Genesis 37, chapter 1. Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. So Jacob is finally back in the land of his fathers. Remember the land that God brought Jacob's grandfather Abraham to, the land that he gave to Isaac, which is Abraham's son, Jacob's dad. And now Jacob is finally back. He has 12 sons, remember, and one daughter that is named. But as we'll see, there's more daughters. Joseph and Benjamin are the two youngest sons of Jacob. The only two that came through Rachel. And remember, Rachel is really the true love of Jacob's life. The other 10 older brothers are adults at this point. Joseph is about 17 years old, we're told. And little brother Benjamin is just a boy. And we're told that Joseph was out pasturing the flock with his brothers, the older brothers, and that he brought back a bad report about his brothers to their father. And so these sons of Jacob are out tending the herds. And remember, Jacob, the dad, was known for tending a herd, right? The animals that he cared for multiplied. Remember, it didn't matter which animals he was given. When he had the cream of the crop, they flourished and they multiplied. When he had the ones that were rejected under Laban, under Jacob's care, they flourished and multiplied. And of course, we know it was the Lord that was causing the increase. And we know that the Lord had instilled in Jacob some skill and some wisdom and some experience that he used to care for the herds. And so we know Jacob has passed on this responsibility of the herds to his sons. And no doubt he passed on what he knew about caring for a herd. And now remember, this was their mainstay. I mean, this was their income. This was their wealth. These herds of animals. And so it was critical that they were managed and cared for properly. This was their job, their careers. You know, Joseph understood this. He understood the importance of doing a job well, of doing the job right, of putting forth the effort. You know, some folks kind of have the wrong idea. They think, well, if I don't put forth the effort to plant a seed, let's say, well, then I don't have to put forth the effort to water it, and I don't have to put forth the effort to fertilize it, and then I don't have to put forth the effort to harvest it. You know, awesome, right? No effort whatsoever, and it works out great, except there's nothing produced, right? There's nothing to eat, there's nothing to contribute. And our society seems to be leaning more and more in this direction, unfortunately. I heard about a man that considered himself an entrepreneur because he's had so many illegitimate children that the government programs provide a handsome living for him. What he fails to understand is the government does not produce money or resource out of thin air, right? The money or resource comes from hardworking, tax-paying citizens. The government is just kind of the big middleman that eats up half the resource that it collects, or however much, as it's handing out or distributing the rest of it to these self-titled entrepreneurs, maybe, that purposefully seek to make themselves a burden, I guess. Well, now there are people in genuine need that can't work, and that have extenuating circumstances that put them in real need. And we are to help those people in need. I mean, the Lord directs us to do that. But for a healthy man to brag about not planting seed, not watering, not fertilizing, not harvesting, but enjoying the produce that comes from others' hard work. And by this, he calls himself an entrepreneur. I mean, if the term entrepreneur, if he means, a parasite living on the hardworking host of society, yeah, I guess he's right. I'm in full agreement. And now that's an extreme case, but we see that more and more. But the case here with the 10 brothers, apparently they weren't pulling the load. Maybe they were cutting corners. Whatever it was, we're not told the details. But it was enough to get them a low rating on their scorecard here, according to Joseph. Now, this isn't a case of tattling or snitching on his brothers just to get them in trouble with Dad. No, this was business. In my career, the 10 brothers would be the aircraft mechanics. Joseph would be like the lead mechanic, and Jacob, the dad, would be like the manager. And God is like the CEO or CFO or all the O's, right? He's the everything. And so the whole board. And so Jacob's the boss, but Joseph is kind of his eyes and ears on the floor or in the field. And the 10 brothers, they're dropping the ball, whatever was going on. They weren't performing their job description to par. Apparently, Joseph couldn't handle this on his own, so he had to take it up a pay grade. And he takes it to the boss, which happens to be his dad. In the Old Testament, there are two main characters that are mentioned that we are not told about a single sin in their lives. And one is Daniel. You remember Daniel in the lion's den and all the other accounts with Daniel. And the other is Joseph here. And this does not mean they were sinless. It just means that they had not sinned in such a way that it affected the way God could use them. As we study the life of Joseph, we're going to see a lot of the attributes of Jesus lived out in the life of Joseph. A lot of similarities. And this one being the first here. Jesus was the Father's eyes and ears here on the ground, on earth. Jesus reported back to the Father. And Jesus had the Father's direction and plan always on the forefront of his mind. Remember, his business was to be about his Father's business. And we can see it here too with Joseph. His business is to be about his Father's business. And so his report from the field about his brothers was bad. It was substandard, less than acceptable. In my world, they received a team journal entry, or they got a warning letter put in their file, as we would say. Verse 3 says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a varicolored tunic. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms." So, what about Joseph's varicolored tunic, or tunic of many colors, or elaborately embroidered coat, some translations, or richly ornamented rug, or long robe with sleeves, or the Technicolor dream coat that the play calls it, right? And so what is the deal with this thing, with this coat or robe or whatever? Well, Holman writes, traditionally this robe has been seen as a brightly colored striped robe. This interpretation is based on the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, whose translators were probably unclear about the exact meaning. When the Hebrew term is compared to the cognate Semitic terms, the translations given are either a coat or tunic with long sleeves or a richly embroidered tunic. Either way, the coat distinguished Joseph as the favorite son of Jacob. So Joseph was favored by Jacob. He was his firstborn from the wife that he intended to marry from the beginning. You remember? But he was deceived into marrying her sister. And so Jacob favored Joseph, and all the brothers hated him because of it. They hated him so much, they couldn't even pretend to like him, we're told. They couldn't even hide their hatred from him. It came out in the way they spoke to him. They couldn't even speak nice. We're told in Acts chapter 7, verse 9, and it'll be up here, it says the patriarchs became jealous. This is Stephen speaking. The patriarchs became jealous of Joseph and sold him to Egypt, yet God was with him. And so they were jealous or envious of him, and they wanted the favor of their father. John Corson writes, of what were they envious? Joseph's coat. Although your King James Bible describes this coat as being of many colors, a better rendering is that it was a coat of many pieces, or literally a coat of big sleeves. You see, in Joseph's day, most coats were actually vests, because most men were working men, and sleeves would only hinder their movement. However, Those who held a position of boss or foreman would be given garments with sleeves. A coat with sleeves was not only a symbol of authority, but it was also a matter of practicality. For in those days, before briefcases and handheld computers, documents, writing instruments, and supplies would be kept in the sleeves, secured by a drawstring at the wrist. Consequently, a man on the job site with sleeves was equivalent to a man carrying a briefcase, talking on the cell phone, wearing Oakley sunglasses. In other words, the man with the sleeves was clearly the boss. The John Corson there. So Joseph, being 17 years old, and he's given this position, of authority over his adult brothers. And it didn't really sit right with them. And that's not hard to imagine, is it? But as you know, age and maturity don't always go hand in hand. There are some very mature young people, and there are some very immature older people. Have you ever been to the monster truck rally? Enough said, right? Anyway, Jacob was the boss, and he was the manager, and he had the right to put who he wanted in charge. And so the who's and whys don't really matter. Often God puts people in positions and we wonder why, why? And whether it be political or in the workplace or here at church or even in the home. I can hear the women thinking, God, you loaded men up with testosterone and then you gave them authority. Why, right? Sounds like a recipe for disaster. And without a God-like love, it is quite often. And so we ask why sometimes. Well, young Joseph, he's the lead mechanic, or he's the trail boss, or whatever you want to call him. And the older brothers, they don't like it. In fact, they hate him because of it. They hate him so much they can't even pretend to talk nice to him. It's a deep hatred. Verse 5 says, Then Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, Please listen to the dream which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field. They were bundling up wheat. These sheaves, it's bundles of wheat. So they're bundling up wheat in the field. And lo, my sheaf, my bundle, rose up and stood erect. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. Then his brothers said to him, Are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Verse 9, Now he had still another dream and related it to his brothers and said, Lo, that's his Asian brother, Lo, I have had another dream. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. He related it to his father and to his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. And so Jacob kind of put that away in his brain. To Joseph's dreams, they respond, Are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? Do you remember what the Jews, the descendants of these brothers, do you remember what they said about Jesus so many years later? In John chapter 19, verse 15, it says, So they cried out, Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him! Pilate said to him, Shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. They said to Jesus, Are you actually going to reign over us? Are you really going to rule over us? Shall we actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? Away with him, kill him, they said. In Colossians 1:16, it says, For by him, by Jesus, all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. And then Romans 14:11 says, For it is written, As I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall give praise to God, or every tongue shall confess. And so the answer is yes. Jesus is going to reign over us. Yes, Jesus is really going to rule over us. Yes, we will actually come to bow ourselves down before Jesus to the ground. So the question is, will you choose to bow before Jesus in this life? Accepting God's free gift of salvation, accepting God's pardon for your sin, offered from God's seat of grace and mercy. Or will you refuse God's gift and be forced to bow as God pronounces your eternal death sentence from his seat of judgment? I mean, that's the question, right? And it sounds like a no-brainer, of course. And back in Genesis, verse 12, Then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, Are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them. And he said to him, I will go. Then he said to him, Go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron and came to Shechem. And so the brothers take the flock to graze, and they go to Shechem. And you remember Shechem is the place that the brothers had avenged their sister Dinah's rape there when they murdered every male in the whole town. They didn't murder just the rapist or just his father, every man in the whole town. Pretty brutal. And so Jacob sends Joseph to check on the brothers, make sure everything's good. Maybe make sure they're not killing another town of people. I don't know. But he wants a status update. And so Joseph makes it to Shechem. And we're told in 15, a man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, What are you looking for? And he said, I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are pasturing the flock. And the man said, They have moved from here, and I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. And Dothan is in L.A., Lower Alabama. And there's a Calvary Chapel there. Verse 18 says, When he saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, Here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we will say, A wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will become of his dreams. But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, Let us not take his life. Reuben further said to them, Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore them to his father. So, in the time they see Joseph off in the distance, to when he reached them, however long that was, they plotted this murder. It didn't take long, obviously. They say, there won't be any bowing down to him if he's dead. That'll solve that problem. And Reuben convinces them to throw Joseph in this big hole in the ground, this big pit. It's actually a cistern that's dry, so that they wouldn't have the blood on their hands. Sure, they put him in a precarious situation, right? But really, it's not their fault that Joseph couldn't find a way out. They didn't kill him. They just put him in a hole in the ground, kind of getting around the responsibility. The Jews didn't really kill Jesus, right? They just brought him to Pilate and demanded that Pilate crucify him. Sure, they put him in a precarious situation, but it's not their fault if Jesus couldn't find a way out of it. And we do that as people, don't we? We like to shed the blame onto others. And so Reuben was planning to come back and get Joseph out of the pit. That was Reuben's plan. He said, throw him in the pit, and he's going to come back later, get him out of the pit, bring him back to Dad. And so Reuben didn't hate him that much, I guess, as the others did. Then in verse 23 it says, "And so it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic and the varicolored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty, without any water in it. Then they sat down to eat a meal. And as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh, and on their way to bring them down to Egypt." Verse 26, "Judah said to his brothers, 'What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh.' And his brothers listened to him. Then some Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph to Egypt." And so they strip him of his robe or tunic. And then Judah has this great plan to sell Joseph to this caravan full of Ishmaelites or Midianites. The Ishmaelites were the descendants of Abraham through Hagar. You remember their son was Ishmael. The Midianites were descendants of Abraham through Keturah. Keturah was Abraham's wife after Sarah went to be with the Lord. And so by this time, though, any of the desert tribes of people were referred to as Ishmaelites. And so we're not sure exactly who these people belong to, but that's what they were called. And so they sell him for some silver. They make a profit here. And so you remember, Jesus was stripped of his tunic also, right? And he was sold out by Judas for silver. And so you can see the similarities between the life of Joseph and the life of Jesus. Now, sometimes people want to use the word type, that Joseph is a type of Jesus. But that is said in error. And let me explain. Caffeinated and decaffeinated are two types of coffee, right? They're two different types, but they're both considered coffee. A Chihuahua and a Great Dane are two types of a dog, but they're both considered a dog. So if you say Joseph is a type of Jesus, you're saying he is Jesus in a different form. And let me help clarify. Some synonyms for the English word type are kind, category, form, brand, style, variety. And so would you say that Joseph was a kind of Jesus, or a category of Jesus, or a form of Jesus, or a brand of Jesus, or a style of Jesus, or a variety of Jesus? No, you probably would not, I hope. And so, there is a good possibility that the angel of the Lord is a type or a form of Jesus, that it was actually Jesus in a different form. Some think Melchizedek was a type or form of Jesus, and he possibly was Jesus himself in a different form. And that's what type means. And Joseph, was not Jesus in any form. There are just a lot of similarities between their lives, and it's really neat to compare them. And so I myself have used the word type in error in the past, and that's why I'm explaining it to you. And I'm not meaning that whoever it was a type, was Jesus in a different form, but just meaning there's similarities. And so, of course, I was always a D student in English, so you feel free to look it up for yourself there, but that's what I have found here. Verse 29 says, "Now Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit. So he tore his garments. He returned to his brothers and said, 'The boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go?' So they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dripped the tunic in the blood. And they sent the varicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, 'We found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not.' And so Reuben was the oldest brother. And so he was kind of considered responsible for the younger brothers. And he knows that Dad's going to hold him responsible. So he says, 'Where am I to go? How am I going to get out of this one?' is what he's saying. And so they come up with a plan to deceive Jacob. Jacob, the old deceiver himself, right? And notice they use the blood of a goat. And you remember Jacob himself had goat skins attached to his hands and arms when he deceived his father Isaac. And Jacob had dished out his share of deception. But he has been the recipient of some doozies here. I mean, he consummates his marriage with the wrong woman. I mean, that's a pretty big one. It's a pretty big deception there. And now being told that his son has been eaten by a wild animal. I mean, could you imagine what that would be like? And so the brothers fabricate false evidence to really sell this lie, to really sell this deception to their dad. And we're told in verse 33, then he examined it, Jacob did, and he said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. So Jacob tore his clothes, and he put sackcloth on his loins, and he mourned for his son many days. Then all his sons and his daughters, that's how we know Dinah had sisters, or a sister, all his daughters arose to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. And he said, surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. I think the brothers were under the delusion that with Joseph out of the picture, they would be the favorites from now on. But what they didn't count on was the enormous loss that Dad had suffered here. He was never the same man. You don't come back the same person after suffering a loss this big. Yes, Joseph did not really die. He's not really dead. But in Jacob's eyes, his reality, he just lost his favorite son. And he saw his clothing drenched with blood. There's no question in his mind that his son is dead. Jacob will never be the same man. God will use it for good, and he can use it for good. But he will be different. You don't suffer a loss like that and it not change you and change your life. Well, then what happens? Well, day after day, they sit and watch their dad suffer this loss. For many days he mourned. They could have come clean and told Dad, and sure they would have suffered the consequences. And they could have gone and purchased Joseph back. He was for sale. They might have had to pay more, but they could have got him back. But they just chose to sit there and let Jacob, their father, suffer day after day, week after week. And just very cruel of these men here. And they finally attempt to comfort him. But, they can't begin to even relate because they know Joseph isn't even dead to begin with, and they hate his guts anyway. So it's no loss to them. And Jacob, it says, would not be comforted. And he figured that he would never get over it. That he would mourn for his son the rest of his life, he says, all the way to the grave, all the way to Sheol. I'm going to be in mourning. I'm never going to get over this, he says. And so, as we take communion this morning, I want us to focus on God the Father this time. As we've been kind of comparing the life of Joseph and the life of Jesus, and how Jesus was sold by a friend, and Jesus was really torn to pieces, but not by animals, but by men, right? And what was that like for the Father? To sit and watch his son being torn to pieces, all the while being mocked and spit on, such disrespect. And God, he restrained himself. God the Son restrained himself. God the Father restrained himself. He restrained his anger. He restrained his fury. He restrained his wrath. Watching his son being devoured. Not helplessly. It was much worse than that because he could have stopped it at any moment, right? But he chose not to. Not out of hatred or envy like the brothers of Joseph, but God chose to allow it to continue out of love for us so that we could be saved. In a million years, do you think you could come up with something harder for God to go through? for God to experience, for Him to prove His love for you? I mean, there's nothing harder. He did the most difficult thing He could possibly do to prove His love for you and for me, and to suffer the consequences of our sin on His shoulders. You know, those 10 brothers, they longed to be Dad's favorite like Joseph. They longed to be loved like Joseph was loved. But you know what? We are that loved. We are loved far greater than that. We are Dad's favorites, like Joseph. We are His favorites. You and me, we are God's favorites. How incredible is that?